I never thought my life would change in the middle of a grocery store. At 42, I'd become used to the predictable rhythm of my days. Work, home, the occasional glass of wine, and a book I'd half finish before bed. Loneliness was a quiet shadow that followed me everywhere, but I'd grown numb to it, hadn't I? Or was I only pretending not to notice the ache? I was reaching for a carton of milk when I saw him. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a young man standing by the cereal aisle, turning a box over in his hands. But something about him held my attention. Maybe it was the way his dark curls fell over his forehead, or the boyish curiosity in his expression. What was it about him that made me pause, linger, and watch a little longer than I should have? "Excuse me." His voice broke the silence, warm and unexpectedly deep. "Do you know if this one's any good?" He held up the box, his fingers brushing the edge lightly, like it might hold more than just sugar and grains. I blinked, startled by the question. How long had it been since someone spoke to me so casually? "I wouldn't know," I replied, a small laugh escaping before I could stop it. "But if it's colorful and sugary, it's probably worth a shot." His lips curved into a grin, the kind that lights up a face and warms a room. "Guess I'll take your word for it. Thanks for the tip." There it was, the pause, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why did I feel a sudden urge to answer, to give him more than just my name? "Sophia," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Leo," he offered, his grin widening, as though we'd just formed a secret pact. Was it his confidence that drew me in, or the effortless way he seemed to belong anywhere he stood? Why did I care at all? We talked a little longer, nothing special, just idle remarks about the overpriced apples and the relentless winter outside. But every word felt significant. Every second stretched out like it meant something more. And then, just like that, he walked away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he'd been. Why did my heart feel lighter, as though something dormant inside me had stirred? Was it foolish to feel this way over a stranger, someone I'd likely never see again? Or was it simply the reminder that life could still surprise me? I turned back to my cart, the faintest trace of a smile on my lips. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder that I couldn't get him out of my mind. Was it ridiculous to feel this way over a brief encounter in the cereal aisle? Maybe. But every time I replayed his smile, or the way his voice carried that casual confidence, I felt something stirring inside me, a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The next week, I found myself back at the grocery store. Was it habit? Or was it hope? Hope for what? That he'd be there again. That fate would offer me another fleeting moment of light in my otherwise quiet life? Did I even have the right to hope for that? I shook my head, pushing the thought away. But as I reached for a bag of oranges, there he was. Leo, standing at the bakery counter, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his dark curls catching the soft light. Was it a coincidence, or was I looking for a sign where there wasn't one? Before I could overthink it, he turned and caught my eye. His face lit up, and he raised a hand in a casual wave. Why did that simple gesture make my chest tighten? "Hey, Sophia," he called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the store. He remembered my name. Why did that feel like a victory? I smiled back, trying to ignore the flutter in my stomach. "Hi, Leo. Back for more cereal advice." He laughed, the sound as warm as I remembered. "Not today. Thought I'd try my luck with bread instead. Got any tips for that?" Was he teasing? Or was there something more behind his words? "Fresh is always better," I replied, moving closer. Was it foolish to feel this pull toward him? To find myself gravitating toward his energy like a moth to a flame? We ended up walking through the aisles together, our conversation flowing as easily as it had the first time. He told me about his studies, architecture, and how he loved the challenge of creating something that blended beauty with purpose. Was it his passion that drew me in, or the way his eyes lit up when he spoke? "Do you ever feel like life gets too routine?" he asked suddenly, his tone thoughtful. "Like you're just going through the motions and forgetting to actually live?" I paused, his question hitting closer to home than I cared to admit. Did he see that in me? Did I wear my loneliness so plainly? "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "But it's easier to stay in the routine than to risk breaking out of it." He nodded, as if he understood more than his years should allow. "But maybe it's the risk that makes it worth it." His words lingered long after he walked me to my car and said goodbye. Was he talking about bread, about life, or about something else entirely? And why did I feel like he was daring me to take a chance, on him, on myself, on something I couldn't quite name? I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my mind. His words, "Maybe it's the risk that makes it worth it," stayed with me like an echo. Why did they resonate so deeply? Was it because I'd spent so many years avoiding risks, choosing safety over possibility? Or was it because, for the first time in years, I wanted something I couldn't predict or control? The next time I saw Leo, it wasn't in the grocery store. It was purely by chance, or so I told myself. I decided to visit the small cafe near my house, a place I hadn't set foot in for months. And there he was, sitting by the window, a notebook open in front of him, a cup of coffee in hand. Did I hesitate? Of course. Was I foolish to think he'd even remember me? But then he looked up, and his face broke into that familiar grin. "Sophia," he called out, his voice cutting through my doubt like a beacon. "What are the odds?" I smiled, my heart racing as I approached his table. "Maybe better than we think," I said, surprised at my own boldness. Was it strange that I felt so at ease with him, or was it stranger that I was even questioning it? "Join me," he asked, motioning to the chair across from him. And just like that, I found myself sitting there, my fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't planned to drink, listening to him talk about his latest project, a design for a community center. He spoke with such passion, his hands moving animatedly as he described his ideas. Was it his energy that captivated me, or the way he made me feel like I belonged in his world, even for a moment? At one point he paused, his gaze settling on me. "Do you ever think about doing something different? Something that scares you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Did he know what he was asking, or was I reading too much into it? "I think about it," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. "But thinking and doing are two very different things." He tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "But what's the worst that could happen? You fail. Or you succeed and realize it was worth it." Why did his words feel like a challenge? A dare I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept? Or was it less about courage and more about admitting what I wanted? We talked for hours, the world outside fading away. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car again, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Was I imagining the way his hand brushed mine, or the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long? As I drove home, my mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. Was this just a fleeting connection, or was it the start of something more? And if it was, did I have the courage to see it through? It had been 2 weeks since that coffee date, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something between Leo and I had changed. Every time I saw him, whether it was in the grocery store or passing by his university, I felt that same pull, a magnetic force drawing me toward him. Was it just a fantasy, or was there really something simmering beneath the surface? The problem, I realized, was the growing tension between us. Not the kind that was obvious, but something subtle and undeniable. A look that lingered just a little too long. An unspoken word that hovered in the air between us, waiting for one of us to say it aloud. What would happen if we did? Would the fantasy shatter, or would it bloom into something more? I couldn't tell him how I felt, not yet. The age difference alone made me feel like a fool. Was it wrong for me to want someone so young, so full of life? Did it make me pathetic, grasping at something fleeting when I should have been content with what I had? But when he texted me one evening, suggesting we go for a walk in the park, something inside me said I couldn't turn him down. It wasn't a grand gesture, not even a date, but the idea of spending time with him, of sharing space without words or expectations, seemed like a chance I couldn't pass up. I met him at the park the next afternoon, and from the moment I saw him, something shifted. He was standing by the fountain, looking out at the water, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He looked so young, so full of promise, and for a moment, I felt my heart ache with the knowledge that I could never be the one to give him all of that. Youth, freedom, the future. He turned when he heard my footsteps, a soft smile breaking out across his face. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice light but warm. Was it just me, or was there something different in the way he said it? Something like hope, or maybe even anticipation. "Me too," I replied, my voice a little shakier than I intended. We walked in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet filling the quiet space between us. And then, without warning, he asked, "What's stopping you from taking a risk?" The question caught me off guard. Was he really asking what I thought he was asking? Was it about us? Was he suggesting that we what? I stopped walking, turning to face him. "What do you mean?" He met my gaze, his expression serious. "You've been holding back. I can see it in the way you look at me. You want to take a chance, but you're scared." "Why?" I swallowed hard. Was it really that obvious? "Because I don't know what it means," I said quietly. "I don't know if it's something real, or if it's just a distraction." His eyes softened. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything. Maybe it's just two people seeing where the moment takes them." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was ready to step into the unknown. But the fear still lingered, fear of judgment, of making a mistake, of opening myself up to something that might break me. "What if it's not just the moment?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's something more?" He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us, and in that moment, I felt the weight of our connection, the pull that neither of us had named. Was it possible that he felt it too? Or was I fooling myself, projecting my own desires onto him? Before I could ask another question, he reached out and touched my arm gently, his touch sending a shiver through me. "Then maybe we'll figure it out together." I looked up at him, feeling the intensity of the moment. Did I dare take the leap? Or was I going to hold back, scared of what might come after? The next few days were a blur. Was it his words that rattled me so much, or the fact that he had made me question everything I thought I knew about myself? I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his eyes, the way his presence seemed to fill up every empty space in my life. Was it just an infatuation? Was I fooling myself into thinking that there was something real here? I knew I couldn't avoid it much longer. Something had shifted between us, and the tension between us had reached a breaking point. I could feel it in the way we spoke, in the way he looked at me when we crossed paths. There was a question in his eyes, something he was waiting for me to answer. And the longer I delayed, the more that silence became unbearable. One evening, after another casual meeting in the park, I couldn't hold back any longer. I invited him to my house. The decision felt reckless, impulsive even, but it was also something I couldn't ignore. Was I hoping that by inviting him into my space, I'd be able to finally confront what was between us? Or was I simply too tired of pretending that I didn't want him here in my life, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to admit before? "Leo," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my stomach, "I want you to come over." He looked at me with that familiar intensity, as if measuring the weight of my words. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone softer than I expected. I nodded, a surge of courage rushing through me. Was it foolish to invite him in? To risk letting this grow into something that neither of us could control? "Yes," I said, a little breathless. "I need you to come over." And just like that, we made plans. The hours between our conversation and his arrival seemed to stretch, each second amplifying my nerves and excitement. Was this the moment where everything would change? When he finally arrived, I felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The doorbell rang, and my heart skipped a beat. I opened the door to find him standing there, a slight smile playing on his lips, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. Was it his calm demeanor that made the air between us feel so heavy? Or was it the fact that, despite everything, neither of us had yet said what was really on our minds? "Hey," he said, stepping inside when I motioned for him to enter. "Nice place." I closed the door behind him, feeling a wave of nervousness wash over me. Was this what I wanted? Or was it just a fantasy I couldn't let go of? "Thanks," I replied, my voice more clipped than I intended. "Can I get you something to drink?" He shook his head. "I'm good for now." "So what's this about?" I led him to the living room, offering him a seat. I could feel the energy between us shifting, the air thick with the unspoken tension. Was it possible to want someone so much and still not know what to do with it? "I wanted to talk," I said, my voice quieter now. "About us. About everything." His eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something deeper in them. Understanding, maybe, or just a willingness to see where this could go. "I think we should," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not rushing anything." I don't want to force you into anything you're not ready for. Was I ready for what he was offering? Or was I still too afraid to take the first step? After the evening we spent together, I felt both lost and certain at the same time. It seemed like there was now an invisible yet powerful thread connecting us, one that was undeniable even though neither of us was sure where it would lead. I tried to stay objective, not rushing into conclusions, but every look, every touch we exchanged stayed with me for days. The time we spent together seemed to remind us both of how much uncertainty there was in the air. No matter how much we tried to keep things casual, our conversation started to go deeper, more personal. It felt like we weren't just talking about our days anymore but about what trull. One evening after work was particularly long. We sat at the table, cups of coffee in front of us, talking about dreams and fears. Between the words, there was a comforting space that we had created together, without any obligations or complications. His eyes held more than curiosity. There was a readiness to understand. You know, sometimes I'm afraid that it's too late for change, I said, glancing back at the years that had passed, at what had come before I met him. It feels like I've been standing. He laughed softly, then leaned in as if he wanted to say something important. I don't think you've missed anything. Sometimes we fear change, but it can bring so much joy. Those words, simple as they were, struck deep. Maybe, after all, it wasn't about age or missed opportunities. It was about the fear of not being worthy of what could come next. I had been waiting for a moment to change things, and maybe that moment was here. We sat in silence for a while after that. I felt that deep understanding settling in. He was right. There's no age at which change is impossible. If I wanted something, I had the chance to make it happen. A few days later, as the days grew shorter and the autumn chill crept in, I found myself growing more comfortable in Leo's presence. It wasn't just about the physical connection we'd shared. It was the way he made me feel, alive in ways I hadn't experienced in years. His youthful energy was contagious, but it was more than that. He had a depth to him that went beyond his age, a kindness that made me rethink the boundaries I'd set for myself. It wasn't easy to admit, but I knew I was falling for him. It wasn't the kind of love that I expected. Not some idealistic romance, but something raw and real. I tried to keep myself guarded, to hold on to the notion that this was just a fleeting moment, but deep down I knew this was more. The fear of it being temporary, of him eventually moving on as young people do, was a constant hum in the back of my mind. Still, I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel. One evening, when we were sitting on my couch, just talking, our conversations growing deeper with each passing day, he looked at me with a quiet intensity. "Is there something you're not saying?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. I hesitated, not knowing how to frame the words that were swirling in my head. Was I ready to say it? Could I admit what was happening? My chest tightened with uncertainty, but I knew I couldn't hide it any longer. I think I'm starting to feel something more for you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze softened, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Was it a relief to hear those words out loud, or was it a weight lifting off both of us? I couldn't tell, but the silence between us felt charged, full of unspoken understandings. Finally he spoke, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I feel the same way." His words were simple, yet they seemed to echo louder than anything else we'd said before. "But I need you to know that I'm not just looking for a fling. I don't want to make you feel like this is temporary." I was taken aback by his sincerity. Was he serious? Could this really be something lasting, or was I just dreaming? But his words, his steady gaze, made me believe him in a way that nothing else had. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "Scared of what people will think. Scared that it won't work. Scared of the future." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "I get it. I don't know what will happen either, but I know what I feel right now. And right now, I don't want to let you go." In that moment, I realized that sometimes you can't predict the future, but you can choose to take a chance. The fear that had held me back for so long, fear of judgment, of mistakes, of being too old or too different, began to fade away. Maybe love didn't have an age limit. Maybe it wasn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. Maybe it was about this connection, this shared experience that we were both ready to explore. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't alone in it. We were in this together, and that was enough for now. As weeks passed, the world around us continued its steady rhythm, but inside, everything had changed. Leo and I, though still uncertain about what the future would hold, embraced the present. There were moments of doubt, sure, whispers in my mind questioning if we were doing the right thing, wondering if age, society, or expectations would tear us apart. But each time I looked at him, each time he reached for my hand or smiled at me with that quiet understanding, I knew that the path we were walking was ours and ours alone. We spent more time together, quiet afternoons at my apartment, walking through the city streets, or sharing coffee in the park where we had first met. Every conversation felt like a small revelation. Leo brought out parts of me I thought were lost. My spontaneity, my ability to laugh at myself, the joy of feeling something pure and uncomplicated. It wasn't perfect and we both knew it, but it was real. And, sometimes, that was enough. One evening, as the first snowfall of the season began to fall, we sat in front of the window in my living room, watching the white flakes drift down like tiny stars. We had spent the day talking about everything, his dreams, my regrets, where we saw ourselves in the years to come. I don't know what's ahead, I said quietly, my voice barely above the hum of the heater. But I'm not afraid anymore. Leo looked at me, his eyes soft, full of something deeper than just affection. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, he replied, his voice steady and unwavering. In that moment, the weight of my past, the worries about age, about time, about what others might think, all of it seemed to melt away. It didn't matter. What mattered was the here and now, what we were building together, however imperfect it might seem to the outside world. We had found something rare, a connection that went beyond age, beyond expectations, beyond the things we were taught to believe. I leaned back against him, feeling his warmth, the steadiness of his presence. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lonely. The future wasn't a question mark anymore, it was a promise that we would face it, hand in hand, no matter where it led us. Love, I realized, wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone who made you feel seen, understood, and accepted. It was about embracing the imperfections, about growing together, and daring to take a leap, even when the path ahead was unclear. And in that moment, I knew that I had found that with him.